Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Wait Patiently for the Lord. And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job, where we're looking at Elihu's accusations continue against self-righteousness of Job. So Job chapter 35 verse 1 through 3 says, "Moreover, Elihu answered and said, Do you think this is right? Do you say, My righteousness is more than God's? For you say, What advantage will it be to you? What profit shall I have more than if I had sinned?" So Elihu again refers to Job's complaints. First of all, thinking that there appeared to be no advantage to being righteous. And Job said back in Job 21:15 and Job 34 verse 9 in the last chapter, and I picture Elihu, he is pointing a finger as he's talking to Job at this time when he asked him if he thought it was right. And Elihu, he accuses Job of denying God's moral order. And once again, we see that Elihu goes on to put words into Job's mouth. He is misquoting Job, and he misrepresents the position that Job has stated. In verse 4 through 8, it says, "I will answer you and your companions with you. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, they are higher than you. If you sin, what do you accomplish against them? Or if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness a son of man." So the first part of his answer is that Job gained nothing by sinning or not sinning, because God was so high that there is nothing that men can do that can affect God. And it only affects other men. And Elihu, he's defending God's divine sovereignty by arousing that God isn't affected by Job's sin or by Job's innocence. And Elihu questions Job's consistency in saying that God will vindicate him at the same time as saying it makes no difference whether he lived a sinful life. And we know that human sin does affect the sinner, and his personal conduct does make a difference in his life. And Elihu, he's late to the party as he wanted to have Job and his friends to understand that God is greater than man. I mean, that's what Job's friends were all arguing while they were making their accusations. And that God is greater than man and God is beyond man. And Job and his friends already discussed that earlier, as mentioned, and they were in agreement. And Elihu's idea is that it was good so far beyond man, or that God was so far beyond man, that there was nothing man could do to God's benefit. And Elihu thought that Job had lost his fear of God and godly appreciation of God. In verse 9 through 12, it says, "Because of the multitude of oppressions, they cry out. They cry out for help because of the arm of the Almighty. But no one says, Where is God my Maker, who gives song in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth and make us wiser than the birds of heaven? There they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men." So Job complained in chapter 23 that God had been indifferent to his situation and that God hadn't answered his prayers, seen in Job 24 verse 12 and Job 30 verse 20. And Elihu, he's encountering good advice here in verse 9 through 11. But some of it doesn't apply to Job. And in times of misery and hardship, people cry out for relief, but they're not always given the due recognition to God of who God is and what God can do. And their cries are self-centered, and they don't acknowledge the blessings that God has bestowed. And cries for relief from distress aren't the same as prayer. And God is able to give joy even in the darkest set of circumstances. And I like that Elihu, he points out that man seeks God in their time of need, but their seeking often isn't sincere. And we see that so often around us. Somebody might go through something very traumatic or hard, and they show like if they have faith in God, but they don't have true, sincere faith. They don't recognize God as their maker, their creator, as their potter over them, and they're the clay. They don't recognize God's comforts or the wisdom he gives. And when people cry out to God in such insincerity, Elihu said that God doesn't answer them, and he doesn't answer because of the pride of evil man. And I just want to make a point that when we talk about sincerity, one of my friends, Brian Peckham, that does videos as well, he always says, like he points out that God wants sincerity. God knows when someone's being sincere or not. God knows those who are his, and God knows who's authentic. And Elihu said this with full knowledge that Job complained to God that God wouldn't answer him. And therefore Elihu, he freely associated Job with the insincere, proud, and evil men. In verse 13 through 16, to finish the chapter's verses here, it says, "Surely God will not listen to empty talk, nor will the Almighty regard it. Although you say you do not see him, yet justice is before him, and you must wait for him. And now, because he is not punished in his anger, nor taken much notice of folly, therefore Job opened his mouth in vain. He multiplies words without knowledge." So God may withhold an answer to the pleas of mankind because of human pride. And Elihu, he could give 3 reasons why Job's prayers hadn't been heard. First off, he's pointing out that pride. Second, wrong motives. And third, lack of patient trust. And all the theological talk missed Job's predicament completely, because we know that God has declared Job righteous and blameless in his eyes in the opening chapters. And Elihu was no more of a help than these other 3 stooges or knuckleheads of Job's friends. And Elihu suggested that Job's suffering wasn't the fullness of God's answer, or he would have been punished Job for more the sinfulness of his speeches. And Elihu, he actually thought that God had overlooked the folly of Job in his useless words. And Elihu, he views God as continuing to extend grace to Job. And Elihu thought that if Job really was a godly man, then God should have answered him by now. And that is a fatal mistake to make, that we should know the answers of God right away because we're more godly. The fact that God hadn't proved his ungodliness. That is, Elihu's mindset, that God hasn't answered Job because God hasn't proved Job's, godliness. So to wrap up today's chapter, we continue our study here where we're looking at Elihu. He confronted Job of his perceived self-righteousness. And Elihu, he questioned Job if he was more righteous than God. And in verse 4 through 8, Elihu lectures Job that God is greater than man, that God is further above than he could imagine. And verse 9 through 12 shows that Elihu stating God doesn't answer the proud even if they're oppressed. And we see that the chapter ends with Elihu telling Job that God doesn't want to hear his empty talk, that God is looking for sincerity. And Elihu probably saw Job as a false empty seeker. And Elihu saw Job sought God with human arrogance and pride. So that is the viewpoint that Elihu has of Job. He thinks that Job is prideful and arrogant, and that he's ungodly. Now I want to go over to James chapter 4 and read verse 1 through 3. The Apostle James says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight in war, yet you do not, because you do not ask. You do not have because you don't ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. So when we aren't receiving from God, we need to check, have I even asked God for my needs? The other thing we got to look at when we don't receive from God is, are we seeking with the wrong motives? God knows what's best for you. So if you're praying, for, a El Nino car or whatever, $1 million type car, do you really need that $1 million car? So Job was thought to be among those lines by Elihu. And, that's the nugget to take out of today. But we'll see you next as we're going to look at Elihu lecture Job about God. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and we will see you back on Friday for chapter 36. So have a great week up ahead the next couple of days. We'll see you back on Friday.